Hi, my name is Jacob, and welcome to another episode of Abrasive Conversations with Jacob Cloete. This particular podcast is dedicated to have difficult conversations in the world, in South Africa, and elsewhere. Now, today's conversation is about the so-called colored identity and some of the backlash and the interesting developments that happened after this. With me, I have Shanelle on the line. She is not in South Africa. She is actually joining from Europe. Shanelle, welcome.
Thank you, Jacob, and thank you for having me.
The honor is mine. I'm so glad that there is people that I can have conversations with, especially when it comes to difficult conversations. So you have seen the episode that me and Danielle made, and after listening to it, you said you agreed to large parts of it, but there is some level of contribution that you would like to make. Can you just, before we get into the questions and the things that the conversation, just share what the rest of the audience, what were your first impressions and how did you get there?
Okay, all right. So to begin with, looking at the open podcast chat, I think when I first watched that clip, I didn't really have a reaction at that time. But as the conversation progressed and subsequent events following that clip that went viral, I started really looking at the dynamics of what was actually happening at that time. And looking at your podcast where you had that conversation with Danielle, I wanted to more reflect on the historical concepts and the historical context of how these different, whether there's stereotypes, generalizations, questions surrounding identity, and how this historical events have shaped over the last century in South Africa and how it plays out in policy formulation post-democratic South Africa. So I think most of what I would be adding to this conversation is to look at that chronologically and then get to where we are today.
Now, let's start there. Let's start with your background because we know each other now for a while. So I have some level of detail as to who am I speaking with, but I don't think the podcast or my listeners in particular have an idea. So before we enter that conversation, could you please explain to the audience where you are situated at, what you're busy with, and what is the current research that you are busy with?
So I've always had an interest in history and politics in South Africa, particularly looking at my own heritage and identity and how we navigate that post-democratic South Africa. I've made it a very core part of my being to go into those uncomfortable spaces and go into the historical concept and really analyze it to a point where we can really look at it from a historical perspective, from a factual perspective, and also from a perspective that really erodes misconceptions and misinformation. So currently, I'm very much detailing, particularly on South African history, particularly with the Khoikhoi groups, which make up of the Griqua, Korana, the Nama, and the other Cape Khoi formations in the Western Cape, including the Sun. So this has been a very long journey, but also the emphasis of this journey is to really get into the uncomfortable truths of our history and also to get into the facts of our history. I think this would lay a good foundation for social integration in South Africa and really understanding different groupings and different communities and how we can bridge those divides to a point where we can actually view ourselves as South Africans and we can erode or take away those misconceptions that we have of each other.
I'm so glad that you are focusing on those things that makes us uncomfortable and that you base that on facts. So let's start the conversation. Where would you like to start? Apart from the questions that I sent you, where would you say if we look at the whole conversation around the so-called colored identity and the debacle that the Open Chat podcast created, where do you say we should start that specific conversation?
It really opened up a conversation that was not happening at a level where technology and social media interaction gets us a point where we could really delve into these conversations. So I think in one point, I just want to cover how I responded to the podcast and the subsequent events that had happened. So initially, when I saw the clip, I didn't really have a reaction, and I was trying to question myself, and why did I not have a reaction? Was I becoming numb to some things that were said? Or was that not the worst that it could have possibly said to the so-called colored community? But I think once I really started like switching in to the dynamics of it was after. And what I found is that I listened to quite a few podcasts after that. And these are very prominent figures in, if I could say, the podcasting world. And also outside, they have quite an influence on directing or influencing conversation. So one of the things that I found in a particular podcast was this conversation that really started to delve into critical race theory. What makes one a racist? And who can be racist in this sense, right? So I think very briefly in critical race theory, you're looking at a bias or prejudice of a particular individual or grouping of individuals, and then the systemic power to actually impact on those prejudice and biases. And then very quickly after, we had the Patriotic Alliance leader, Gayton McKenzie, come out, and he said that he would be laying charges against the podcast. And almost instantaneously, that conversation really, really shifted. And what I mean by that is because as soon as I was listening to this conversation that was happening in this podcast, it was like, okay, what they said is really, really wrong. It's unacceptable and it should never be said. But can we talk about the anti-Blackness in the so-called colored confirmation? And at that point, I just really switched because on one side, you have very hateful or very degrading comments that are made. But can we talk about the anti-Blackness in the so-called colored community? And that conversation started shifting away from the very point of contention of what is being said to a particular group to, but can we discuss the issues within those groups in comparison or in reflection to another group? So that divide almost instantaneously came in, where the discussion went on to the anti-Blackness in the so-called colored community. And I, for one, have previously called out this anti-Blackness within this community. And I've never been shy from that. And also looking in terms of identity, the colored identity within South Africa and how that relates to Blackness, which I want to go into further as we have this conversation. What does it mean to be Black? And looking at the historical evolution of Black identity in South Africa. And the reason why I started shifting in this conversation is because a particular community were frustrated or hurt by the comments that were said and reacted. However, the finger pointed to, but can we talk about you? It was not reflecting on what was done to this community, but rather, do you have a social or ethical or moral position to be angered by this? And then it really rapidly changed where Gayton McKenzie, the Minister of Sports, Arts and Culture, became centerfold of this. And then we see previous tweets that he was made, and this came up. And now the focus had shifted to Gayton McKenzie and his use of words as well, which I would like to delve in, not particularly on the tweets, but in terms of racial slurs in South Africa or slurs that have been used to dehumanize individuals, make them less than humans, and the effects of these labels on these particular communities, which I think is seemingly erased, particularly when you look at the Khoikhoi and San groups with the labels Hottentot and Busman, and how these are freely used and how our institutions react to this. But I'm just going to leave it there, and then I will expand a bit more on that as we have the conversation.
Thanks so much for that response. Before I continue the conversation, I also want to share my initial reaction to the video. I made it clear so many times, and because you also read my book, is that I don't have a strong sense or a strong connection to the so-called colored identity. I have a much more, I would say, nuanced type of identity where I see myself as indigenous South African, and if I have to identify racially, then I would identify myself as Black, but not really as colored. But I see myself first, if I have to talk about an identity per se that links me to the African continent, then it's always an indigenous ethnic identity. But it's more complex than that, because that specific identity was not created in a vacuum. There were so many other ethnic groups and indigenous groups that formulated and helped shape that specific identity. So I didn't have any sense of response to it. Interestingly, yesterday I was at a military base in Cape Town, and I had to get my personnel information. So for those people who doesn't know, I was in the South African Defence Force. I'm a military vet, and I want to get onto the military vet database. And on that personnel information, back in 2003 already, I see they put myself, they put me in as a colored person. And I look at that yesterday and I'm like, but this is not who I am. And I think this is where our conversation would go later in this podcast. The history of this classification, what it meant. But I agree with you. There was a group of people that was hurt in this particular moment. And what happened was the moment Gayton Mackenzie started and that whole debacle went up, the conversation quickly shifted to the anti-blackness within colored communities. And you rightfully explained that there are so many people, including you, that have spoken out against this anti-black sentiment within the colored community way before the open chat podcast. So I agree with you on that, on your on that particular sentiment. There could have been a much better and deeper conversation when it came to that particular moment, and I think it would have been such a richer conversation. So let's then start. Yes, but before let me give you opportunity. Please go.
Yeah, I think while we are on this point of identity in post-democratic South Africa, there's a lot of noise surrounding who is Black and who is not Black. Okay, and I want to look at policy. If you look at the Employment Equity Act and you look at the broad-based Black Economic Act, as it defines Black people, it states that it is a generic term for African, colored, and Indian. Now, let's look at the word generic. Generic means that it is a characteristic assigned to a group or thing that is not specific. Now, let's go into not specific. Not specific says that there is no clear or detailed information. And another word that I can relate to non-specific is ambiguous, which is open to interpretation. So our policy in South Africa already, by the word Black people, is open for interpretation. And this is where it becomes extremely problematic because there isn't a very clear or detailed definition of who are Black people. And it becomes very difficult when you want to have that conversation of the so-called colored identity in relation to being Black. Is there an intersectionality that happens between these two identities? Or is the so-called colored community included by a very specific definition of what is Black? And this is the huge issue in terms of identity with this particular grouping of people. Because on the one hand, you would have, like yourself and like myself, who grew up in a very Black consciousness identity, which would identify with Black, but legislatively would deny you that Black identity because it is opened up to interpretation.
So,
am I clear?
Yes, you are 100% right, and I think that is the dilemma of post-apartheid South Africa. And the sadness for me is that when the Truth and Reconciliation started in the late 1990s, I think it's 1997, when that started, the mandate was everything to do with apartheid. When the land reform process started, it was up until 1912, the Native Land Act. Now, these dates is important because there's a large group of people that were classified as colored people that were of the Khoikhoi and San, but also other indigenous groups. There were Tswana people at one point classified as colored. There was Indian people. There were Chinese. There was Xhosa. There was always not a group in South Africa that were not classified as colored people before that specific moment where the redress in South Africa was supposed to take place. So for me, the colored identity or that specific concept was always problematic. So if you want to rectify the wrongs of the past through laws in specific, then these moments become important. Now, the important question that I think we have to put on the table and think about, not just uh, as colored people or people who were classified as colored, or the people of Khoikhoi and San ancestry, I think everyone in South Africa must put this question on the table. Can we go back to where it started, 1652, and then slowly work our um, through the present, step by step? Because if we start in 1652 and we say that's the moment where the dispossession started in South Africa, then there is more groups of people that is responsible for the dispossession, the hurt, and the erasure of groups of people in South Africa. So that's where my thinking is, because the people that is not being held to account is the Dutch, because they say no, nothing happened with us. We didn't do anything. It was the Dutch East Indian Company. Nothing happened to the British government and the people who benefited from the oppression. So there is no accountability towards Europe. There's only accountability to certain groups of people in South Africa. But the people that was responsible for the largest dispossession and killing all these groups of people in South Africa, and largely responsible for the structural violence that we currently experience in South Africa, are sitting and saying that we are underdeveloped third world countries. And this is where my politics and conversation is, uh, as a member of the Global South politics. So it's a little bit. Uh, I agree with you in terms of the X, 100%. But the X is not going to have a sense of justice for the people that was dispossessed before 1910. So 1912 is important because in 1910, South Africa becomes the Union of South Africa, or the birth of modern South Africa as we know it. So everything that happens before that, the killing, the dispossession and everything, the British and the Dutch is absolved from it.
Yeah, definitely. And whilst I was thinking about the conversation that you and I were going to have, I was reflecting on the previous and the former president, Jacob Zuma, which seemingly at the time, I think he was meeting with officials in the Netherlands, if I recall it correctly, pretty much absolved them from the atrocities that had happened in what became the Cape Colony. And I found that very problematic for many reasons. And I just want to try and narrow it down and bring it back to South Africa in relation to the conversation around identity that we are having. I think there's a very large misinformation or understanding of the so-called color table, which you cover in your book as well. Many people from my interactions have narrowed down being so-called colored to the apartheid definition of what is a colored. It is just very briefly somebody that's not black or not white. But we see historically from census that this evolution or this inception of the so-called colored identity actually incorporated various groupings of people within this identity. We also see that the definition of that identity over at least the last 150, 200 years had changed until obviously the apartheid system, last definition of it, and the people that were put into this category of being colored, right? And I think when we look at the history from those census, we had various groupings of people. We have the Bushmen, we have the Hottentot, we have the mixed other, and so forth. And we see how those various groupings have changed and how they became smaller and smaller as the census and policy and legislation were introduced not only by the Dutch, but also later the British as well, which you very beautifully roll out within in your book. So I suggest people that are listening to this actually do get a copy of your book and actually go and look at that. Then that becomes a question of what was the initial conception of colored or so-called colored identity, which you see refer to all people that were not European. And then you look at it from the apartheid system, which now brings in a race concept of black and white. And I think this has to be very clearly articulated at a very senior level, an understanding of teaching this, whether it's in our school curricula or whether these conversations happen not only on social media, but also on our formal media spaces, where this information can be brought forward to be able to understand, and particularly as you highlight the erasure of the Quaker and Son groups legislatively through that 200, 150-year period as well. And I think with this understanding, it will really begin to make people understand that this so-called colored identity is not a monolith. So it is not just one type of people. It's various groupings of people that have been put into this, although having a shared experience from the Cape Colony. But also the fact that, particularly on the Quaker groupings, the Bikwa, the Nama, the Grana, and other Quaker formations, including the Sun, how that erasure has happened, and what does that mean post-democratic South Africa? And we see how this has played out in the last 30 years with the government's response to the Khoi communities and the Sun communities. And I'm almost questioning, is it ignorance or is it deliberate ignorance on the part of the state in relation to these identities and how these identities were formed and how certain identities were erased by this legislation. And I want to kind of unpack it as we continue this conversation.
All right. I'll put the pin in that so that we can come back into it, because I think you bring a really good point up. Was this ignorance on the side of the government when it came to this particular racial classification and the complete and completely ignoring it? But before we get in there, there's one question that we haven't talked about yet, and that question is, what does it mean to be black? Because it's one of the questions that we actually ask is, and that we said that we're going to reflect on is, what does it mean to be black, and what makes one African? Because I think before we can get into that conversation of the ignorance, there is a group of people in South Africa in general that has to resolve this particular question, especially the latter one. Who is included in the African and who is excluded?
Yeah, I think that is a very good point to start with. And I would like to just delve into both the identity of Black and African. And we've seen over the last 30 years the phrase Black in general and African in particular. And I would like to take this conversation particularly to the African National Congress, right? looking at the Ngorongoro Consultative Conference that was held in 1969 and the position of the ANC then to not include what they deem non-Africans. Okay, so we look in 1955 and the Congress of the People declared its Freedom Charter, and included in this Congress alliance was the African National Congress, the Indians of the South African Indian Congress, the Colored People's Congress, and the whites were of the Congress of Democrats, right? And then you only see the South African Communist Party withdrew membership across racial or ethnic boundaries. Now, the ANC was delved with this particular conundrum, if I could say, particularly in the 50s and the 60s, because if you look at the ANC, I think it was conceptualized in 1909, if I'm correct in that sense. I'm not sure the date. And it was the South African Natives, South African Natives National Congress at that time. By 1940, the ANC took a very different turn of determining who was African and who was Native. In the very founding concepts of the ANC documents that I have read through, they were very specific in terms of who they were fighting for the liberation, and in their own documents refer to it as the Bantu, so-called Bantu people, or the Abantu people, right? And we see, and that very conceptualization of the what became the African National Congress in 1920 through 23, that the Khoikhoi and the San groupings were not consulted or not formulated within the liberation of the ANC fighting for. So we go to 1940s, around the 1940s, and the ANC makes its membership and its leadership exclusively, quote unquote, African. And this conundrum really persisted after 1955. And we see how these interactions had happened with these Congress alliance and particularly the South African Communist Party that were pressuring the ANC to allow membership to what they deemed as non-African people. So we look at the ANC going into exile, and they were really faced with this issue. And we looked at a report from 1958 where the ANC reaffirms its commitment to a non-racial, multiracial society and to work with others who had these same liberation ideals for the South Africa that we all anticipated that we would get post-1994. But nevertheless, the ANC remained closed to all but Africans, quote unquote Africans at that time. And I actually have a response, and I just would like to read it out from the ANC at that time. And it says that nobody can doubt that, however, other racial groups may be oppressed, Africans are oppressed in a special way. As a result, the immediate agreement aims and outlooks of Africans, their daily needs and aspirations, are not identical with those of other racial groups in South Africa. It goes on to say, it is possible to imagine then that the Africans will not be organized as a separate group with separate group interests as long as their position remains. If, for instance, the ANC opened its doors to become a multiracial organization, an all-in political party with a program that would not immediately be the need felt amongst Africans for purely African organization to put forward these views. Okay, so it goes on, and then we look in 1960 how this particular issue became at the real forefront as other groupings within the alliance expressed dissatisfaction, particularly for the ANC that was out in exile, because the ANC had positioned amongst this alliance, this Congress alliance, to be the forefront of the face internationally for the liberation in South Africa. And there was a lot of contentions coming from the other Congress alliance that what would this mean for those individuals that were exiled in terms of speaking on behalf of the ANC if they could not get membership to it. I just want to also just kind of fast forward back to the issue. And then we see early on the Mkhonto weSizwe was formed, but surprisingly, the Mkhonto weSizwe did not have this issue of membership on the basis of racial or ethnic identity in order to be part of this. And in the very foundations of it, we see your Basil February's and others being very instrumental in that foundation of Mkhonto weSizwe, with Basil February not just being in a leadership position in Mkhonto weSizwe, but also, I think, if I remember correctly, was very influential in terms of his writings to many of the others within Mkhonto weSizwe, in terms of understanding what the struggle was, what it meant for them, etc. And we know that Basil February, very early on, had his demise in what is now Zimbabwe as well at that time. But this issue was it really troubled the African National Congress, and the African National Congress always maintained its position on who was African and who was not African, right? And then we further go on to looking at issues that happened between the Bonnie Desai, which was the leader of the Colored People's Congress at that time. And he insisted that there was no way that they were going to subjugate themselves to the leadership of the ANC and the African majority. And he went on to chastise them quite strongly on neglecting the position and the role of minority groups in South Africa, and the fact that the ANC's material at that time of political statements did not reflect the contribution of these minority groups like the so-called colored. Going a bit further into that, we see that there was a time within the middle 1960s when Desai and Cardiff at that time, Cardiff Money, they rebutted a lot of the versions of events with regards to the Colored People's Congress, where they said that they would be open to disbanding or dissolving the Colored People's Congress at that time. And this was rejected by the ANC leadership, and they continued. They said that they would no longer meet with the alliances at that time. So why am I bringing this very key information of what was happening in regard of identity and the politics in South Africa? Because we see that that kind of a very strong positional stance of the ANC in relation to other groupings at that time. But what is very ironic in this case of particularly African identity is that when you look at the history in relation to South Africa, there's a woman by the name of Alice Alexandra Kinloch. And she was born in the Cape around the 1860s, and her family later moved to Kimberley, where she would obviously become very familiar with the mining town of Kimberley and what was actually happening. So she later married, and she moved to England. And in 1895, she linked up with the APS, right? And she was invited to speak to large audiences across the UK of speaking about the injustices of colonialism and obviously the labor systems that were happening at that time. And she referred to herself as the Black race or an African people. And later she went on with Henry Sylvester Williams from Trinidad and John Thompson from Sierra Leone. And they founded the African Association, and they organized the first Pan-African conference in the 1900s in London. So even before the ANC became the ANC, there was an individual which we would refer to as the Pan-African mother of Pan-Africanism, which is a woman that was born in the Cape Colony, that would later, under the definition of the ANC and post-democratic South Africa, now take away the African identity from her, which is absolutely crazy if you have to think about it. And this is history, this is facts. And then you also later see the African People's Organization, formed in 1902, which obviously was for so-called colored people at that time. It was only in 1923 that the ANC, as we know it today, adopted the African rather than South African natives in this regard. So this is why I wanted to unpack that particular identity of African in relation to South Africa, how the ANC interprets African identity and how this plays out in terms of its policy direction of Black in general and African in particular, and how I also highlight that policy doesn't have a very specific definition or clear definition of what is Black. Now let's move to the Black identity. I said that Alice Alexandra Kinloch, in her own writings, referred to herself, and in her own speeches, referred to herself as Black. This was already in 1895, right? We see the foundation of a non-racial society coming out of the African People's Organization, which was so-called colored. Then we see the Black consciousness movement really showing up in the 1970s under Steve Biko. But what we don't hear about and what we don't speak about in relation to Black consciousness is Cyril Peter Jones, which was a leader of the Black consciousness movement, who was actually arrested with Steve Biko, and who actually spent 18 months in prison after that arrest with Steve Biko at that time. We see how Black consciousness infiltrated, particularly the University of Western Cape, under the leadership of Dr. Alan Bussack. So we see a very strong identity of Black consciousness moving within the so-called colored communities within the 70s and the 80s. And then, very disappointingly, by Dr. Alan Bussack's own words, he said that he was Black, but in 1994, the ANC made him colored again. So we see how these identities have evolved and how does it influence politics and how it's now influencing not only policy, but how does particularly the so-called colored identify in relation to these concepts where they were once very integral in part of Alice Alexandra Kinloch of Pan-Africanism, later the likes of Cyril Peter Jones, your Neville Alexanders, and various others that would later go on to be part of the Azania movement and the Pan-African Congress, the PAC at that time, and how this erosion of this identity or participation in these identities is seemingly not discussed into it, and is how I view it, is a gatekeeping on what it means to be Black, or who in this term is African. And I'm just going to leave it there because I know I'm giving a lot of history and I'm just trying to compress it. But I want us to take this conversation to parts that I don't see happening. And I'm hoping that we begin to really start exploring these dynamics from a historical concept to understand where we are and possibly how we can fix it.
Thank you. That I just have one or two observations with regards to your explanation and very detailed, I would say almost lecture on the ANC and especially how the ANC's policies late in post-apartheid South Africa. You see that the disjuncture between Black and Africa, who it includes and who it excludes. And I think this is extremely valuable And people, especially students who listen to this, think that will help them a lot, especially with the resources and the names that you were given. This is really good information. There's, however, a shortcoming, not in your argument. History is brilliant in pointing this out. The issue that I've recently picked out is what you are seeing manifesting in 1993 with the interim constitution, and then later 1996 with the final constitution. And that is law. Law and the legal system in South Africa play a big role in big role in who becomes black and who becomes African. And this is why I'm currently doing a postgraduate diploma in public law to understand this particular system much better. So when I did political studies in public administration, I was introduced to the legal systems and policies. So when it comes to that part, I have a great understanding with it. When it comes to the philosophy behind laws, I have a good understanding of it. But then you come to the working and the interpretations of how does it manifest? How does something get remedy if there is injustice or crime being committed? And most of the conversation in post-apartheid South Africa is brilliant in uh, in spheres where people say, look, there is a much larger issue that we have to deal with. But when you take it to the courts, then that's where the exclusion start happening. And this is in particular those dates that I've mentioned. The ANC came into existence in 1912, 2 years after the formation of South Africa. Uh, and the reason why they came into existence is because the law excluded them from any level of participation in South Africa. Later, there was Bantustans created. They didn't have official citizenship or legal standing in South Africa. So the pass that they were using were actually a passport, but that's not how people interpret it. So black people didn't have any citizenship, legal citizenship, or the majority of them. They were born in white South Africa. They got a level of legal status, but you had this homeland system where people had to go back to whenever the system didn't want them there. So there is a legal history that also needs to be closely read with the ANC's attempt to get recognition within in white, colored, and Indian South Africa, because at that particular moment, South Africa was for white people that was supposed to assist colored people, are supposed to assist um, white people in their specific project. But the moment we start looking at that legal history from 1910, then it's the way I've explained previously. There was ordinances dating back as 1806, 1807. We started with the pass system in South Africa. So you think about a pass system that black people start experiencing later on. No, that system is a legal system that slowly but surely excluded and formulated a system of colonialism that was so sophisticated, learning from all of the past systems of colonialism to actually become a much better system than other systems across the world. So that's just the one contribution that I want to make, is that there is people that need to start looking at the legal history and the legal aspects to the exclusion, and later what the ANC have, the legal means that they have, but to start crafting and changing many of these things that want to do. But let's move on.
Just very quickly.
Yes.
I would have to disagree with you, and I'll tell you why just very briefly, because I think we're going to be speaking for about 2 or 3 hours here, because the ANC was faced with a position where it could reevaluate that, right? And as I highlighted very briefly some of the issues that had happened there were particular things which your book also highlights that were previously done to people who came so-called colored. So then the actions that had happened to that time, and there was no issue that the ANC was very precise on its position then. But it brings us to a post-democratic 1994 situation where seemingly our politics is shifting now, particularly on the so-called colored community, having to now remove itself and looking at a position of where it stands and for itself. And the hypocrisy and the double standard that comes in there is that the ANC in the late 1950s, 1960s, took a very strong position and held that position. But like I'm highlighting, the hypocrisy and the double standards that come in now post-1994, where other groupings are seemingly want to take a very similar or exact position, has been seen as being separate or not wanting to work towards a non-racial society or integrated society. So the point that I'm trying to raise is that we also have to be very honest in our interpretation of that history, and again, how we see this playing out post-1994, particularly with the so-called colored community.
I'm glad you bring out the word honest. So if people like Ellen Usak and them are honest, then they see that since the classification from 1828 onwards, a particular colored consciousness was created. And that colored consciousness slowly but surely developed into this type of ideology. As a oppressed group of people that is now in this particular group, we have to respond in a particular way, because one of the questions that we are going to talk about, I think, deals a lot with this. What does the politics of the colored look like? Because from the late 1800s onwards, this becomes a question that the colonial state has to have to deal with, but also there's other groups of the interest groups that came into. So even though there was a strong level of Black consciousness amongst the intellectual elites in South Africa, and amongst some of the cadres and the comrades of the resistance movements, there was not really a broad-based Black consciousness that you find amongst the colored communities. And this is what I try to explain in my book. There was different concepts and different levels of consciousness that is exclusionary when the question is only a colored question. Because up until today, there is the offensive Bushman consciousness. There is a Hottentot or Hottentot consciousness, where people identify and their families identify more with those concepts than that they identify with the colored identification. And the same with Greek. There's people in a Nama community, and specifically, they identify with those identities rather than with a colored identity. But yet, this other group of people that is classified as colored people. So this idea that there was a universal Black consciousness amongst those groups, it was never the situation. Within universities like the University of the Western Cape, yes, the elite push for a common Black conscious identity, but that didn't translate to the rest of society.
Oh, for sure, definitely. And I think when I was unpacking these identities, as we see with most of these organizations, they all had mission education, or they were either educated abroad outside of South Africa. So obviously these concepts and its integration within society were really held within a very elite position. But I would like to argue because maybe if you look at the positions of what is happening under particularly Dr. Alan Busak within the Western Cape, at the Northern Cape, and the protesting, and also the fight against the apartheid state at that time, had some influence from there. Again, we can still argue whether it was just amongst the elites, but that had some impact, I would like to argue. But maybe we could have that discussion for another day and possibly just stick with the order of today, or the programming.
Yeah, let's stick with the order of today. So I see we are reaching an hour. So can we do two more questions? So let's do the first one. Let's talk about benefits and the beneficial relationship that a lot of people bring up, like colored people benefited during apartheid. What's your response to that?
I know I'm going to sound controversial here, but in the main, the majority of so-called colored people did not benefit from the obvious socio-political, economic, slightly better preference that they had. And I'm going to look at a particular reason, because when you look at socio-economics, the socio part of it refers to the studies of the behaviors of people. And there was a paper that was presented at a conference of the Economics Society of South Africa to look at the early roots of colored poverty and how the 19th century can best explain the situation. And when we look at this particular paper that was done, I think it was done in 2011, and we also have a look at the economic development of the colored population and the agenda of 1973 on the Theron Commission from the apartheid to have an inquiry regarding the colored community. And just so we can just keep it to a limit, I'm just going to just very briefly go through this. So you look at the socio part, which deals with the behavior of people, and then you get the economics. And the socio part, which is unique and particular to groupings that became so-called colored, is often not discussed from a historical perspective, and how this relates to a poverty cap, or how it relates to economic advancement, even when policy is in favor of this particular community. And when you look at the Theron Commission, I'm just going to highlight just a few points on it. It looked at the population of the so-called colored community, and what it found was about 20% of that population was of a middle groupings. Then you had about 40%, which moved between the middle class and chronically poor, and about 40% of the so-called colored community as in 1973 were perceived to be chronically poor, right? And then we look at certain aspects of how this could have affected the so-called colored community. And again, we go back to history that is either not talked about, not spoken about, and definitely not taught about within our curricula on these specific things that are happening. And I know I'm going to go back to the ANC, but even in its own papers, it speaks about 1652, and then it jumps to about 1850. So there's about 200 years within its own documents and mission statements and other various documents that completely ignores about 200 years of what happened within the Cape Colony, which your book also highlights as well, and the people that it affected there. So I would like to argue, and I will argue this, that the so-called colored in the main did not benefit from the political or the economic preferences by policy to this particular community. And I would like to focus them on certain aspects. One, dealing with identity, knowing, and we discussed this previously, of how there has been this continuous change of identity and shifting identities of people that was ascribed to them by others, and how this has dogged this particular community in the South African population, how that feeling of identity relates to belonging and existence. And I think we can discuss maybe another time on the psychology of these shifting identities and what these people went through during that time, starting from 1652. Another aspect that I would like to look at is the DOP system and how this manifests in the sociology of these groupings of people, and how how the wine system was introduced in these farms for unskilled labor, and how these patterns of alcohol abuse, fetal alcohol syndrome, and alcohol-related illnesses and behavioral pathologies still exist within these communities, going back not from slavery, right? I think we don't forget that a large majority of so-called colored people experienced slavery in South Africa. We don't talk about the intergenerational trauma of the so-called colored community. Then we have a situation, which you highlight in your book as well, at the end of the abolishment of slavery, and how other mechanisms and ordinances and policy were introduced to be able to sustain the economy that was happening in the Cape Colony, and how they found various ways of still trying to retain this labor almost for free or for nothing at all. And as we go on, we look at the Hottentot population, your Griquas, your Namas, your Koranas, your Cape Kwe, and your San communities, looking at this population century in terms of their education ability, the ability of literacy to read or write. Were they rural? Were they urban? And we find that within these studies, and we find within the census that date back more than 100 years, you find that largely the Hottentot population was almost completely rural. There were low literacy skills in there. Things like looking at facts like there was formal schooling and informal schooling and a whole range of things. And we look at how these things have, even within the so-called colored community, that how other groupings within that community have still been long trapped within the cycle of poverty, even post-1994, and how new policy direction excludes the fact that these particular groupings within the colored community have a very unique and special history that deserves and should focus on a different type of policy direction to deal with these other matters. One of the things that was important in the Theron community, the Theron Commission, and I found it absolutely astounding, that even though so-called colored people might have had better schooling or better supply, slightly better schooling or a slightly better supply of materials for schooling, the Theron Commission found that in I think it was 1974, about 85,000 children were registered in what was then Sub-A. But by Standard 9, there were only about 5,000 children in Standard 9. So we have to ask the question, what was happening to the so-called colored community, even though they were deemed to have slightly better preferences in terms of schooling? And outside of brick and mortar, you find that there is a very deep sociological issue within the so-called colored community, which I feel that needs to have urgent attention, and to political parties that might listen to this, might use this as a basis of effectively looking at the history of this community to effect the very much needed change that we see. Another point that I would raise is the prison system, right? And, looking at the prison system post the abolishment of slavery, how the Cape Colony source different ways of trying to get this labor for free or for nothing at all, right? And we see what happens with the colored population, which was extensively used in forced prison labor, particularly in the Western and the Northern Capes, and how this practice was still prevalent by policy until the 1980s when this was abolished. Now, we have to look at the relation of the systemic nature that had happened, particularly to the so-called colored communities in this regard, and how its post-systemic or post-institutionalization ramifications play out post-1994. Now, we see that this high imprisonment or supply of form of labor in the Cape Province, right at that time. And we looked at by 1986, there were like over 20 prisons across the Western and the Northern Cape, accommodating some 10 to 12,000 prisoners that were used for free labor. I think we even see today in terms of the demographic side that the so-called colored, particularly so-called colored males, are disproportionately highly imprisoned in compared to its demographic numbers and others within South Africa. I think these are important aspects to look at and how this plays in relation to the benefits that this community had supposedly benefit from if you look in relation to the white community and the Indian community in this regard that did not face the same history and did not face the same systems and institutionalization that is specific in this regard to the so-called colored. We also look at the institutionalization or the high scale of large institutionalization of colored boys during apartheid South Africa as well, and how these reformatories for young boys came about, and how a lot of these children were deemed by the state as being either neglected, destitute, delinquent, and so forth, how they were placed into these reformatories, again, how this plays out intergenerationally in terms of that institutionalization and how that institutionalization happens when it is younger children. And one of the things that I found interesting in my own research on this particular issue is that there was Chisholm notes that for the non-white child, particularly the so-called colored in this case, that the reformatory existed alongside the prison as a form of control over his movement and his labor. And I think that there isn't really a lot of domestic or South African research to be done on these particular issues. I think we can only closely relate it to Black Americans in the US that have faced similar or the exact same types of institutionalization and how this is playing out in America today. But again, I just also wanted to point out beyond the institutionalization that it has happened, we look at Project Coast and the mandrakes that were pushed into particularly so-called colored communities. At that time, this came out in the TRC, the formation of gangs within the Cape, and how this has actually proliferated across all so-called colored communities outside of the Cape, whether it's in Gauteng, KZN, or the Eastern Cape as well. So, yes, I know I've said a mouthful, but I would argue in terms of did the so-called colored benefit, and I would say no, with context. even though brick and mortar might be seen as a benefit, but we seemingly forget to ignore that apartheid didn't just happen. There was a lot that was happening, and a lot that is specific to the so-called colored communities. I'm just going to leave it there, and maybe one day we could actually take a deep dive into this commission report that was instituted in 1973 by the apartheid state to look at the colored, so-called colored communities, and other further reports that also show post-1994 that although by income, household income, the so-called colored is above the quote-unquote African, that there seemingly has been a regression whilst there been advancement in other groupings, whether it's white or Indians or colored. We see that by those household incomes and the economics of it, that the so-called colored is actually regressing. And I think we have to really dive into this. And one of the points that I think we'll touch on at the end of this discussion is what does the politics mean for this community? And how will the politics affect the change within these communities to therefore see the benefit on a larger scale outside of the social issues that is confined to these communities?
So I largely agree with you on this particular point. But once again, I'm going to point out a short term. The issue is, especially in post-apartheid South Africa, is literally that apartheid part in post-apartheid. The dispossession of people, the oppression of people didn't start with apartheid. It has a much longer history. And this is what you rightfully point out, is that if we have to look at the colored people as a political entity and a social group, then we have to think about it in 1652 up until the present. And then you can see the long lines or the long history of this oppression. And you've touched on many things that I've pointed out, but my issue is just that this thinking that South Africa's history or that apartheid era was the worst for a group of people. There's a much longer history. Now, the interesting thing in your response that you point out is the 200 years. 1652 and then 200 years later. The reason why the African National Congress only have a response or start talking 200 years later is because the Khoikhoi and San groups resisted colonial oppression for about 229 years with over 19 wars. And it took that long for the rest of the colony to get to the other groups on the frontier. And there's a lot of research and papers on frontier politics and how frontier politics look like at the point. One of the first missionary stations in South Africa, I think, started around 100 years later with George Smith, and then the Moravians later came in 30 years, 40 years later, so like 140 years before people were in Vernadendal. You started seeing the first wars in the Seerveld, where Tsitsikamma and Cape, that part of the Eastern Cape, you start seeing the first encounters with the Xhosa people. So it took about 150, close to 150 years of resistance before the colonial forces first get to the Xhosa people. So the African National Congress responds, like I said, in 1912 to their specific struggle. But if you think about the struggle of the so-called colored person or the Hottentot, the Bushman, or whatever grouping they prefer, or the Greek word, then you see it's a much longer trajectory. And it's not just South Africa. That resistance went into Namibia, and it went into Botswana, and even parts of Zimbabwe. So it's a much more complex issue than these legal periods. Apartheid was a legal system, but it erases the colonial legal system, which played a large part in the oppression of this group that we're talking about. For example, the prison system. You rightfully point out that colored men are disproportionately affected by the system. They were hunted. The Bushmen during the British era were hunted, and they were imprisoned in Breakwater Bay in the waterfront, which is now Protea Hotel. So that's where the resistance were put. Before them, there was people already on Robben Island. So there's a long history, not just in apartheid, but it starts from the earliest moment. Even before Van Riebeeck, there was already people that some of the ships put on Robben Island. So there's a long, long history. So in that sense, I agree with you. And I won't even say what context, like you said, to what context. I'm saying that we cannot talk about a post-apartheid South Africa anymore. We need to talk about the formation of South Africa and the flaws that it comes with.
I 1000% agree with you in this regard. And this is what I'm trying to highlight, particularly when you hear what so-called colored people benefited from apartheid. And I'm like, I'm not particularly sure, because there is so much prior to apartheid that nobody speaks about that is specific to the so-called colored communities starting from 1652, including the Quaker groupings and the Sun as well. And what I also want to just highlight very briefly with this conversation in terms of, did so-called colored communities benefit from it? Or did so-called colored communities move within identities in terms of what was beneficial for them? And I would like to just highlight very quickly on the political response by various so-called colored congresses and movements, the non-European Unity Forum, etc. When they congregated in 1961, again, I think you probably said to me that it was a very elitist, but we see in our politics over the last 100 years that a lot of our politics was shaped by elites as well, and how much of that actually trickled down to the ordinary societies and communities. Well, we could debate about that at another time. But also just highlighting these different formations at the Colored Convention that happened in 1961. And some of the, well, not recommendations, but some of the outcomes of those conventions that we see happening there and the findings from there, they found, I'm just going to read it very quickly, that the convention declared that the colored people are a separate group only by discrimination. Thus, it rejected the principle of a separate racial status. It pledged itself to work for the creation of a non-racial democratic South Africa. For this, a new constitution would be needed and was determined by the National Convention. It continued to go on that the continuation of the committee was appointed to enter into these negotiations. What they sought from this convention that happened from various groupings, and it was held in Cape Town and was national. So it was not just Cape Townians or people within in the Western Cape. At that time, it was a national convention. And in this convention, they repealed for the Group Areas Act firstly. They condemned industrial color bar or job reservation and stated that education should be free and accessible for all. It should be integrated and so forth and so forth and so forth. So there's a few highlights there. So my point here that I'm trying to raise in terms of the politics is the so-called colored guilty of moving within identities of where they find benefit. And I've just pointed out from that convention that there was a rejection of the identity. Yes, there was some who were supported and participated within the politics of the day at that time. We get into the tricameral parliament as well. But what is interesting to see out from census there was the almost rapid decrease of those who participated politically by the vote from 1960 up until 1983, where we see about 88% of so-called colored people actually rejecting the tricameral parliament at that time. And why I'm pointing this out is because if that identity at that time was beneficial, then maybe there's an argument to make that so-called colored people sat back, did not participated fervently in huge numbers to the politics of the day, or did not formulate itself in terms of protesting or other forms of actions against the apartheid state. And then we find the so-called colored post-1994 that seemingly is saying now a very common thing that we hear, I wasn't white enough in apartheid and now I'm not black enough. And then the argument comes in, well, now you only want to be black because it's beneficial for you at this time. So again, I would argue some of these very wildly held perceptions of this community in terms of that intersectionality that some spoke about, of how the so-called colored is seemingly be able to move within identities where it is beneficial for them. And that's why I'm saying this history is so important to highlight, to be able to say, well, let's step back again. Did these people really benefit from this system? Yes or no? And we take it from there with all the historical context, with all the data, with all the information that we have at our disposal. But also, when we look at identities, which we covered in terms of being Black and who is African in this regard, and how seemingly there is this notion that so-called colored people are now trying to move within identities for their benefits. And moving to the politics of the day and looking at the Patriotic Alliance as an example, the Member of Parliament, Ashley Swords, raised this within Parliament. Remember, I watch Parliament quite often. And he raised this to the Speaker in terms of Black in general and African in particular. And does this mean that the so-called colored and the Quaker groups and the Sun groups are not African in particular? And I found the response from the Speaker almost hilarious at this point. And I'm just like, okay, but these are the type of conversations that I'm seeing coming from particularly the Patriotic Alliance in Parliament that are asking these very Sorry, I think I got muted there. That the Patriotic Alliance was asking these very specific questions. You also see within the Patriotic Alliance how they are asking the questions into relations to employment equity as well. And I think for me personally, seeing these questions being asked and accountability in terms of, okay, well, the employment equity says X. Why do we have Y? What is happening between X and Y that we are not meeting, even by employment equity targets, these specific racial groupings, particularly within institutions of higher learning and other government spheres as well. And I know I'm just kind of like off-ramping here, but I think that was an important point to make, to see that shift of politics happening now. Why is it happening? To understand the historical concept. And in my opinion, I think it was inevitable. And I think it was a little bit too late, but I guess better late than never, I guess. But I think in terms of the political situation that is happening now, and in some quarters, a very strong push against it, it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out in particularly 2026 and how that so-called colored vote moves in terms of its political consciousness and its political advancement.
Shanelle, how do we resolve this? I'm a person who always end on a positive note. My politics is on my website. My politics is on my podcast. Politics is everywhere. I'm pro-Black. I'm pro-African. I have complex shared ancestry. And it's that complexity that I agree with. I am pro-marginalized groups in every sense of the word. I openly and against many people's maybe advice, I'm pro-Palestinian because they experience a similar level of apartheid that my forefathers experienced. So my politics is always open. Just how do we resolve this? The way I see it, where my politics and my direction is, the conversation is less who is the African, who is the Black, and who is not. But the conversation is that we have a shared ancestry. We share grandmothers and grandfathers across many groupings. So if that's the case, then most probably we are family. So how, as a family, do we resolve this in going forwards? So that's my politics, and that's where I put my attention. My politics is also now like the Afrikaner people, Indian people, Chinese. If you stayed here for a long time on the African continent, then I see you as an African if you want to take this particular continent forward. So for me, the question is way beyond. Yes, there is historical injustice that we have to do something about. When I recognize that fact, I always ask myself, so how do we do it? So this is my question to you. How do we resolve this?
Okay, all right. So just in 30 seconds, I too am pro-Black. I too am pro-African. And believe it or not, although it seems like I was really going at the ANC, was a very big supporter of the ANC. However, like you said, how do we deal with these issues within a family? The first step is understanding what the issues are from a factual basis. Secondly, there has to be honesty. There's a lot of dishonesty within South Africa about many things. Following that dishonesty, there has to be a sense where we either individually within groups or as South African people begin to try and separate ourselves from our own biases and our own prejudice and our own understanding of what we think is true, right? To be able to listen to each other, to learn about others from those people, rather than trying to teach those people about who they are, what they are, and how they should navigate spaces in this regard. And finally, I think after we have really begin to have that honest kind, and I see that we are currently trying to do this national dialogue that I'm sure probably aims to achieve some of these things. I still feel that the national dialogue in the sense is not going to deal with the very real issues. And to try and look at a positive side, to close this from a very positive perspective, I am 1000% for South Africans and for South Africa. And I want us to work. I do believe that we are better together. I don't know if I'm stealing that phrase from some political party. I hope not. But I'm not trying to think which political party said that. I hope it's not the...
It's the ANC. It's the ANC.
Okay. Well, as long as it's not the Democratic Alliance.
No, it's the ANC.
Okay, but I do believe in us. But that... And I know I hate to put buts after saying something because it kind of gives an impression that you're not sincere.
So why do you put a but?
Because I still feel that there's a lot of dishonesty amongst us.
But the whole podcast you've already shared it.
And no, and I just want to highlight it. I do think we can go forward. I don't have a doubt that it's not possible for us. Again, I raise questions on honesty. I raise questions on being deliberate in what we do, of not repeating past mistakes and not isolating others from this idea of being South African, being African, and what South Africa can be. So I will just leave it there. And I will really ponder on it about why I bring in the but, because I really don't like putting in a but, because it does make it seem a bit sincere. But I do believe in South Africans. I do believe in South Africa. I do have a great hope. And I do believe that we can be the country that we want to be.
You see, but that, I thank you so much. Shanelle, it was truly, it was an honor to have this conversation.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
And I hope anyone who is listening to this would listen to the conversation right through. This reiteration of Abrasive Conversations is going to be audio, because I've realized that there is many people who just put the audio podcast on and go about their daily business listening to people. So this is going to be completely audio. So thank you for joining. You are the first guest, and I hope there will be many more of these conversations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacob. And I love the fact that we don't always agree, because it really pushes us to rethink and reevaluate things. And I guess it would be very boring if we always agreed with everything in its entirety. So I'm really happy about that. And I'm sure that particularly my mother in this case, when she does listen to this, will probably be like, oh yeah, you don't really like to be challenged, but I like a good challenge now and again. So thank you.
All right. Have a lovely day.
You too. Cheers. Bye.
Bye. Bye.